Good evening. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots. Uh, I just spent about 40 minutes, I think, making a video I'm not sure I made. So we're starting another video. We are in the Gospels. It's Sunday night, December 11th, 2016. And we have just listened to Jesus' discourse as written by John in John 5:19 through 47, 20 some verses. Very difficult to explain, very difficult to understand. We're now going to an occasion in which Jesus and his disciples are going from one place to another. You remember when we studied Ruth on previous occasions, it's like the first and the second trip through the Bible. We're in our third trip now. You remember that the corners of a farmer's property, when the farmer or his employees picked grain or whatever it was that had been planted and was growing and was going to be harvested, that the rule was the landowner would leave some food. So if there was somebody who was poor, didn't have food, they could come under the corners of his property, and food had purposely been unharvested so that the poor could go get it and eat it or sell it for food or whatever. It was, in fact, as you recall, a couple of Wednesday nights ago, studying in the Old Testament, we were talking about Sodom, and not the destruction of Sodom, but just before that, Abraham and a few others had been in a little war, and Abraham won, and so he paid tithes to a high priest by the name of Melchizedek on the spoils, or what he got for having won the war. And then later he said, I don't want any benefit, I don't want to make anything, a profit or money or spoils or the gold in anybody's teeth or the garment off of somebody's back because I won the war. The only thing is whatever my servants ate. So that while I and my servants were all fighting, whatever was on this property that we ate while we were there, that's all we're going to take. This is just another example of how things were. If an animal was going from one place to another, and we're talking one country to the other, not one county to the other, how are you going to carry food for it? So certain things were to be left for the benefit of people passing through. Keeping that in mind, we now go in Matthew 12, and this has to do with some of Jesus' disciples plucking grain. Then we're going to go to the book of Mark, and then to the book of Luke to see what they all say about the same incident. Matthew says, At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day. Many people think that the purpose of the Sabbath was for worship. It was not. We make all kinds of mistakes regarding the Sabbath. I have even seen like a Baptist church when I was growing up. They referred to Sunday school as Sabbath school. Not too bright. If they spoke other languages, the languages that are built on Latin, like Portuguese, Spanish, Italian. The word for Saturday is the same word as the word for Sabbath. I don't know sometimes when something is just so easy to understand, it's just sitting there in front of you. But I guess it's the way we were raised or what our grandfather used to call something. I don't know. It was a Sabbath. The Sabbath was given for man to rest. There were laws about resting the land. My grandfather used to trade off so that if for a couple of years he grew corn on a particular plot, he had 400 acres. Then the next year he would grow wheat or something else. Because, you know, certain things pull nutrients out of the soil. And if you always plant the same thing, you're going to deplete certain nutrients in soil. There were many reasons for this. But it was on the Sabbath when you don't work. And the disciples were hungry. So they started plucking ears of corn to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said, "Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." So Jesus answered, "Have you not heard what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him?" Now I've got to take you back and explain what it was David did. Because Jesus is reminding the Pharisees. See, they were religious, but they weren't good. They kept laws. They wore robes. At exactly 12 or exactly a certain time, wherever they were, they would stop in the middle of the road and say big, long, special prayers, and then go out and be nasty to somebody. That's being religious without being good or having had that religion do you any good. But Jesus refers to something that King David did. Didn't you read what David did? He and those that were with him were hungry. Let me read a little bit and I'll see how much this particular portion gives you, and what it doesn't give you, I'll fill in. David and some of his warriors went to the house of God. This was at the beginning of David's reign. It was still the tabernacle. David wanted to build the temple, but he wasn't allowed to. So he was a great deal like Michelangelo. He was a musician, he was an artist, he was an architect, and he gave his son the plans. But David is with some of his men that were with him, and they went into the house of God and ate the showbread. And it was not lawful for them to do it. Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and they're blameless? Then I say to you, is this place greater than the temple? Two more verses. Let me read them and then let me explain to you what he's talking about. But if you had known what this meant, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. This is what happened. David's men were hungry. They had not been home for 3 days. They'd been fighting. They were starved. They came to the temple. Now, I wish I had that board that's over on that part of the room over here so I could draw on it. But I'll try to come up with an example here. Hang on. The tabernacle and the temple were about in this shape. You would come into the building part, and this much of it was holy place. Here's a veil. This is the Holy of Holies. There's furniture outside. Now, this is true whether it's the temple or the tabernacle. The temple was more elaborate, bigger, better, more costly, but the same. On the outside over here, there's an altar made of brass. And it's that altar where the sacrifices were done. Right here, still outside of the building and made of brass, is a laver. It holds water. The priests would wash their hands because here they're doing blood sacrifices and so forth. And whenever they needed to, they would wash their hands here. That's 2 articles of furniture on the outside of the temple and the tabernacle. Now, let's go into the actual temple or tabernacle. Here, there's one piece of furniture. That's the Ark of the Covenant. It's made of gold. Only the high priest went in once a year to ask for forgiveness of all the people for all the year, for all their sins. There are 3 more pieces of furniture left, and they're in the holy place. I'm going to see how this works out on the screen. Okay, right here it's called by different names. We're coming on to Hanukkah season. And this is the lampstand. It held the oil. And because this is inside and we don't have windows, that lit everything that happened in the Holy of Holies, or the holy place. Now, that's here. Right here, at the beginning of the Holy of Holies, is the altar of incense. This is where John the Baptist's father, who was a priest, was ministering when the angel came and told him he was going to have a son and he was going to name him John. Then the same angel went 6 months later to the Virgin Mary and told her she was going to have a son. Now, we come over here. We have the last piece of furniture. All these are made of gold. These two out here are made of brass. All right, here we are. Right here is a table of showbread. It's usually spelled S-H-E-W, bread, showbread. These look like tortillas, although in some pictures you get somebody, they make them look like little loaves of bread. But they're actually like tortillas. There's a table, and on that table there are 6 tortillas on top of each other here, and another 6 here. That is showbread. Everything here talks about Christ. The altar, the laver for washing and purity. Jesus, the light of the world. Jesus, our food, our bread of life. The altar of incense. And the ark of God's legal promise and commitment with his people, the Ark of the Covenant. Inside that was Aaron's rod that budded, a dish full of the manna that fell during the 40 years in the wilderness, and the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. All of this speaks of Jesus. Over here, the table of showbread, speaking of Jesus, our sustenance, our life. Every day, this bread, and remember, you had to be from the tribe of Levi to do anything in the temple at all. To mop the floor, to dust it off, to light the candle of the sacrifice, you had to be a Levite. They literally lived off the temple when they were on duty. Some of the sacrifices that were offered, you bring a lamb. They didn't offer the whole lamb. They offered a portion of the lamb on the altar as a sacrifice. And the rest of it fed the priests who were working on duty at that time in the temple or the tabernacle. This bread was baked fresh every day. On this occasion, when David and his men had been 3 days and they were hungry and there was no food, and they went to the high priest, David did, and said, "Can you feed my soldiers?" That showbread, after it was on for a day, was taken off, and fresh tortillas, fresh bread that was made, was put in its place on the table of showbread. So David went to the high priest, and the high priest said, well, we have just taken some bread off the table, and we have freshly baked bread to put in its place. So we will give you for your men to eat the showbread, which is a day old. What was the problem? Well, that was to be consumed only by the priests. That's the only problem I can see in the entire Bible. Do I know everything? Who knows? There might be some things I've managed to miss. In anything that I can remember ever having read or taught, that's the only thing I can figure out that they did wrong, was that this showbread was to be eaten by priests only, just like the offerings. You know, there was offerings of flour, there were offerings of oil, as well as offerings of birds and goats and sheep and so forth. A portion was for them to eat. That's just the way God set it up. So, keeping that in mind, let me now, I read what Matthew said. Let me read now what Mark says and Luke. And let's see if they give us additional information. If not, I'll comment more. And it came to pass that when he went through the fields on the Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples, remember, they were allowed to eat food. The question might be, can they do it on Saturday? What would be wrong about doing it on Saturday? It was considered work. Pick up a sandwich and put it in your mouth and chew it. You know, it was considered work to get it manipulated. They could walk on the Sabbath less than a mile. In fact, some not temples, but synagogues would build long porches with long railings to stretch and make the synagogue go farther, so that the part that they walked not on the synagogue was less distance. I mean, you can go crazy when you try to follow some of these laws. But if you've got a bunch of people to whom laws are important and not the reason for the law, it can create a problem. They plucked ears of corn, and the Pharisees said, why do you do it on the Sabbath day? It's not lawful. Well, it's not lawful to pluck corn. That's work. And he said unto them, have you not read what David did when he had need and was hungry, he and those that were with him? How he went to the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priests. It was lawful for the priests to eat, but not anybody else. And that was the priest on duty. And gave also to them which were with him. And he said unto them, Jesus said to these Pharisees, these big religious guys, religious without love, full of words and laws, but little low on compassion. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man, now we just went through in the 5th chapter of John, which I don't think was fully recorded. We just went through the Son being Lord because God the Father has given him that authority. And he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man, that would be Jesus, is the Lord of the Sabbath. Well, let's go with Luke. We've got 5 verses, and this subject ends. Luke says in 6 verse 1, it came to pass on the 2nd Sabbath after the 1st. That's pretty clear, right? Not the Sabbath, but the second one, and the second one comes after the first, like Second World War came after the First World War. He went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. Taking, you've got uncooked corn. And certain of the Pharisees said to them, why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? In other words, work. And Jesus said, have you not read what David did and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God and did take and eat the showbread and gave also to them that were with him, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests alone. The unlawful part. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say the same thing. It was lawful only for the priests on duty to eat the showbread after it had been on the table of showbread for 24 hours and the fresh bread was put up. And he said unto them, the Son of Man, Luke refers, in the book of Luke, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. In other books, other people writing it down have where he has sometimes referred to himself as the Son of Man, and sometimes he just didn't answer the question. But here he refers to himself as the Son of Man, and he said the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, I'm God. I created the Sabbath. You're going to tell me what can't and can't be done on the Sabbath? Now, we've got about 20 minutes left. Give me just a minute to figure out how far I want to go. We have an incident in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about a man with a withered hand being healed. And then we have in Matthew, Mark, that's all, Matthew and Mark tell us about organizing the kingdom multitude being healed. And then we get to what I thought we would get to tonight. And that's when the 12 disciples of Jesus are ordained. This is something we don't hear a lot of sermons and teachings on, but we have it in Matthew and Luke. When Jesus ordained his 12 disciples and gave them gifts of healing and gifts of casting out spirits. We're not going to get to that tonight. I thought we would. So we have two other subjects to consider before we get to that. I think we should do one of them. So let's proceed with that. And then we'll turn the chat back on and see where that takes us. This is a man that had a withered hand. We've dealt with people who have had leprosy, where skin and bones and tissue become nothing and it falls off. This is withered. This is Matthew. When he was departed, he went to the synagogue. Synagogue, temple. Difference? One temple. I just described it to you. In Jesus' day, there was a temple. Many synagogues, one temple. There has not been a temple since 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. From information, I haven't written on it in the last couple of weeks because it's my terribly busy personal life. But I read my mail every day from Israel. And we're getting closer. Not that you can build a building faster now than you used to be able to build one. But aside from that, there's even consideration of perhaps having a temporary temple, a structure, if they can get a temporary. We're talking about the Orthodox Jews. Those Jews that are not Orthodox are like Baptists, Catholics, Pentecostals, holiness, whatever. There are those that are really into it, and then there are those that aren't. I'm talking about the Orthodox Jews. There is talk among them, and the Sanhedrin, and my video on that is still getting people who read it, and that happened in September. And I'm guessing because I'm one of the few who says he declined. But if they ask Rabbi Kahaim to ask him again to act as high priest, I have no doubt he would do it. He declined because he's a very humble person, and he wanted others to be considered also. But depending on what it means to go to the Temple Mount, if it means, and we preachers have never even considered this concept. I've been preaching this last month I was ordained for 60 years, so I was a preacher long before that. We never even thought temple, except we said temple, we're thinking building. But who's to say that there aren't other concepts that other people have that might not be equally biblical? So here we go. Synagogue. If you can't make it to the temple, where do you go to read the word and talk about it? go to a synagogue. 10 Jewish males been bar mitzvahed, and a rabbi, and probably a cantor, and you've got a synagogue. Paul was always going to the synagogues because there were a group of religious people there, and he'd go on Saturday and say, hey, guess what? I'm an evangelist. I'm a Bible teacher. I'm going to be preaching out here the side of the river, or in my case, Lake Arrowhead. Tomorrow, Sunday, why don't you come and listen to me preach? Paul did a lot of that. This was the synagogue, not the temple. They departed. They went to the synagogue. There was a man there, his hand was withered. And they asked him, they asked Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? There again, can't do work on the Sabbath. I don't consider praying for the sick work. Of course, I had the doctor tell me Tuesday not to work this week. And it's Sunday, it's not even a week yet. I don't consider what I'm doing work. They asked Jesus, if you were planning to heal this person, is it okay with Moses' law for you to do that? I personally don't see it as work because it's all done with the word, be healed. If Jesus speaks it, be healed. If a disciple in Mark 3 or Luke 6, now ordained and given the power to heal, says be healed, is that work? They ask him so they can accuse him. And he said to them, what man among you, if he has a sheep, and he falls into the pit on the Sabbath day, are you not going to bend over and pick up the ewe, which is a female sheep, and get it out of the ditch? Is that work? Or are you and your super big religious person going to allow a suffering animal to suffer because it's Saturday over something that simple? And he said unto them about this sheep, how much more is a man better than a sheep? We got a man here that's sick. You want to argue about what day it is? Is it lawful to do well on the Sabbath? Then he said to the man, okay, guys, you argue about Sabbath, you argue about healing, you argue about the difference between being a blessing to a human being or female sheep. He said to the man, stretch forth your hand. And the man stretched forth his hand, the one that was withered, and hey, it was just like the other one. And the Pharisees went out, and they held a council against him to try and destroy him. Good luck. You're going to destroy the ministry of Jesus. Mark says, he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand, and they watched him, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man with the withered hand, stand forth, step up. Going to start a prayer line. And he said unto them, all them out there, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? To save a life or to kill? You know what they said, what you should say when you're dumb, don't know what to say, you say nothing. That's what they said. Nothing. They held their peace. And when he looked around about on them anger, they were grieved. He was grieved for the hardness of their hearts. He said to the man, stretch forth thy hand, and he stretched it out, and the hand was restored like the other. The Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians, another group, another religious group. Hey, it's easy to start another religious group. You find another couple of people that believe like you, and you want to go down and sit and have coffee and discuss and try to ruin somebody. It doesn't take a whole lot of courage or a whole lot of ability to do that. Luke finishes it, and with that, we're going to finish. Luke says, it came to pass on another Sabbath that he went into the synagogue and taught. What they would do is that they would ask Jesus or another person who was learned, another person who understood the scriptures and could teach, to read the scripture and then explain it. So that's what it means when Jesus went into the synagogue and taught. They would have given him the scroll. It would have been, rolled up on the edges. He would have read from where the last person left off and then would have explained it. And the scribes and Pharisees, now we got scribes. Scribes were the people who knew the Bible quite well because their job was to make copies of it. So if you make copies of dictionaries and encyclopedias and research articles, and your job is to copy word by word, you learn all these things. So they were pretty smart. They watched him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath day. This is according to Luke. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, rise up, stand forth. And he arose and he stood forth. He got up, front center. Then said Jesus unto him, I'm going to ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil? To save life or destroy it? You want to have a religious argument? You're always going to find somebody to disagree with you. He looked around and he said, stretch forth your hand. And he did. And when he stretched it forth, it was restored like the other one. And they were filled with madness and communed one with the other what they might do to Jesus. Now this is 12, 11, 16. On Wednesday night, we'll be back in the book of Genesis. So for tonight, this ends this video. Then we'll be back with our live group.